Mon nom est Frédéric Bastien. Welcome everyone to this online conference of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. My name is Frédéric Bastien. I'm the director of the center. L'objectif de la conférence est premièrement, de présenter des travaux faits par nos membres de diverses disciplines qui s'intéressent au thème de la diversité. C'est un enjeu important dans notre programmation scientifique, d'où la décision de tenir une conférence sur ce sujet. Mais aussi, deuxième objectif, d'engager un dialogue avec d'autres chercheurs, voire des praticiens qui ne font pas partie de notre centre, mais qui s'intéressent eux aussi au thème de la diversité. The planning process of that conference had started in 2019 under the leadership of the previous director, Dietlind Stolle, who is online with us today, and an organization committee composed of Aaron Herlick from McGill University, Jean-François Godbout et Ruth Dassonville de l'Université de Montréal, had organized a very large conference project for April 2020. Some of you may remember that. It was scheduled to be a two-day conference filled with many presentations, poster sessions, international guest speakers, roundtable with different partners. But of course, you know what has happened last year. So we decided to postpone this activity to 2021 with a smaller format. So cet après-midi, nous aurons 4 présentations réparties entre 2 panels, espacés d'une pause d'une quinzaine de minutes. Et demain après-midi, à la même heure, 13h30, nous aurons 2 dernières présentations qui seront suivies d'une table ronde réunissant 3 professeurs, 3 chercheurs de l'extérieur du CECD, venant de l'Université Queen, l'Université Carleton et l'Université du Delaware. Cette table ronde sera animée par Mme Amen Ben Hamouda, qui est responsable des affaires publiques et des programmes chez À Voix égale, Equal Voice. So that is the planning for this afternoon and tomorrow. So I would like to acknowledge the contribution of Harell, Ruth, and Jean-François, who have worked very hard and for a long time for the organization of this activity. I also want to thank the staff of the CSDC, Esther Harmignac and Wim Wolf, for their support. Je cède sans plus tarder la parole à Jean-François Godbout, qui va présider au déroulement de ce premier panel. Merci, Jean-François.
Merci, Frédéric. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Le premier panel s'intitule « La démocratie est-elle pour les femmes et pour les jeunes? Is democracy for a woman and young people ?» C'est un panel qui va durer 1 heure, donc on a 2 présentations. Je demanderai aux présentateurs là, de se limiter à une quinzaine de minutes, maximum 20. Là, je vais vous avertir en faisant des signes comme ça là, quand vous êtes à peu près à 15 minutes. Et on va y aller en ordre. Donc, on va entendre les 2 présentations, puis après ça, on prendra une trentaine de minutes pour discuter, là, échanger sur les deux papiers qui sont évidemment liés. Je vais juste signaler que, évidemment, c'est des papiers qui sont écrits par des membres du centre qui sont ici avec nous. Il y a le premier papier, il y a les 2 anciennes présidentes du CSDC, il faut le souligner. Donc, il manque juste un papier l'année prochaine avec Frédéric là, et Dietlind et Elisabeth. Là, ça va être vraiment le triumvirat complet. Donc, c'est un papier de Dietlind, Elisabeth et je crois qu'Olivier Bergeron-Boutin de l'Université McGill va présenter « Are young people more willing to accept democratic deconsolidation » en premier. Et en deuxième, on va y aller avec Jordan Mansell de l'Université Western qui est avec nous aujourd'hui, qui va présenter. Non, c'est Allison, pardon, qui va présenter, je suis désolé. Allison de l'Université du Québec à Montréal, avec également Melanee Thomas de l'Université de Calgary et Tania Gosselin, également de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Un papier qui s'intitule Competition and Gendered Prejudice, Failure and Consequences for Politics. Alors, sans plus tarder, on vous écoute, Olivier, et merci pour votre attention. S'il y a des questions, juste gardez ça pour la fin, à moins qu'il y ait vraiment quelque chose d'urgent, de clarification. Vous pouvez toujours le mettre dans le chat. Au pire des cas, on pourra y revenir après. Merci.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for having us. It's exciting to be part of this group and hearing everyone's work today. We are presenting today from a collaborative project with Olivier and Elisabeth. Here we like to contribute to solving the puzzle, or getting closer to solving the puzzle about the questions whether younger cohorts have a problem with democracy or not. Next slide. So we start from the premise some authors found, as we do here, that younger cohorts born in the 1980s and 1990s and around 2000 do not think that democracy is important. The graph that you see here, and I know it's barely visible, shows ESS data in the most advanced democracies, and 9 out of 15 countries show a cohort effect, that is, younger cohorts are significantly less supportive of democracy compared to the oldest cohort. And that confirms, of course, some claims made by Foa and Monk and some others. But this claim has also gotten a lot of pushback. There have been entire journal issues written that young cohorts are even more democratic, that there is a measurement error, and that the original authors exaggerate their claim. And in this project, we try to understand what's up with young cohorts, giving less importance to democracy. Are they really against it and for authoritarian solutions? Is there some sort of antipathy to democracy? Or are they simply not aware and confused and show more apathy? Or are they simply more critical citizens? Next slide. So here are our hypotheses that we explore for this presentation to give you a little bit of a taste. This is not everything we do, but part of it. So first we explore whether younger cohorts are more critical citizens who criticize democracy and how it is enacted today, but still keep it in high esteem or relatively high esteem. So that will be the critical citizen hypothesis. Second, we explore whether younger cohorts are simply confused about what democracy means and how to distinguish democracy from its alternatives. Thirdly, we explore whether it is maybe the word democracy or the abstractness of the concept which explains lower support. And we develop concrete scenarios and experiments that test the reaction to very undemocratic situations. And finally, we explore whether younger cohorts simply have lower democratic knowledge and what effect that has on their understanding of democracy. The data sources in the next slide we use are threefold. So we use, as you have already seen, the ESS data from 2012, which has most items on democratic support. We have other surveys as well, what we call the democratic backsliding surveys, one from the US in 2018 and one from 2019 in the US and Canada. And we also have a COVID and democracy survey from 2020 in English-speaking Canada and the US. So we will draw on all of these data sources, and I hand it over now to Olivier.
Thank you, Dietlind. So let's first look at the critical citizens perspective. This approach would expect that the younger cohorts are more critical of democracy and its concrete practices, while still remaining quite strongly supportive in a more abstract sense. And in short, we see no evidence of this. First, it's clear that younger cohorts are not more critical of democracy than older cohorts. So this figure that I'm showing here is the same as the figure that we showed earlier, except on the y-axis we have satisfaction with democracy instead of importance of democracy. And these estimates in red are the estimates that are statistically significantly different from the pre-1950s cohort. So if anything, youth are more satisfied. So there's really nothing going on here. What we do find, however, is a greater effect of dissatisfaction on stated importance of democracy. Using the ESS data, we ran a simple linear model with dissatisfaction, cohort, and their interaction. As expected, the more dissatisfied, the lower the rating of the importance of democracy. However, note that there are different slopes between the post-1980s cohort and the pre-1950s cohort, so the youngest and the oldest cohort. Therefore, it appears that dissatisfaction has a larger negative effect among the younger cohorts. This suggests that youth's disappointing experiences of democracy translate into a perception that democracy as a principle is not really important. And this is, of course, not what we want to see. So despite disillusionment with the outputs of democracy, we'd like to see people retain faith in democracy as a whole abstract concept. In other words, we would like to see specific support be separate from diffuse support, and this is not what we see. Among youth, there appears to be a lack of distinction between the abstract concept of democracy and the reality that they experience. And it may indeed be harder to make that distinction when people don't have positive experiences in their memories. So in short, when in their view, democracy has never worked, which might be the case for the younger cohorts. Another possibility is that younger citizens are simply confused. So they may be confused about what democracy itself entails or about the undemocratic nature of alternative political regimes. So in this sense, they might endorse a regime that we would all describe as undemocratic, but perceive it not to be incompatible with democracy. So in the figure that we're showing here, there's an interesting phenomenon. Many of those who value democracy the most nonetheless approve of a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Parliament, Congress, and elections. Now, this is quite a strong formulation, doesn't have to bother with elections, and yet fully 44% of young Americans in the right side of the graph and 36% of young Canadians who rate democracy as maximally important nonetheless endorse that strong leader regime. So the numbers being shown here are only among those respondents who rate democracy as a 10 on the 0 to 10 importance scale. So this is quite extraordinary. Those citizens who we would expect to be the strongest opponents of anti-democratic regimes, nonetheless are quite likely to support a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Parliament and elections, which is a strong formulation, right? And that kind of discrepancy is even larger for the younger generations. And there doesn't seem to be nearly as much confusion among the older cohorts. So these figures suggest that the standard measures of democratic support may not be doing so well at discriminating between genuine small d Democrats and confused citizens, those citizens who say, sure, democracy is important, but I also endorse that strong leader who doesn't bother with elections. So naturally, the 36% and 44% figures that I mentioned earlier are even higher if we look at respondents who answered a 9 on that 0 to 10 importance scale. And the lower down you go on the importance scale, the higher the figure. But even for those respondents, it's really quite high. So it seems that not only do young people give lower marks to democracy, but also that those who give high marks do not understand fully what it means and what it implies. So it's also unclear whether we can even trust these measures of broad democratic support that are often used in surveys. So we need to look beyond plain democratic support to understand how people really think about democracy. So with that in mind, we developed new measures of support for democracy that rely on exposing respondents to situations that are clearly undemocratic, and then we gauge their reactions. So we have multiple measures here, including scenarios that depict executive aggrandizement or limitations on voting rights. We have vignette experiments asking about political decisions that clearly transgress democratic norms. And we also have conjoint experiments that present fictitious candidates as violating some democratic norms. The point of these various measures is to ask about democracy not in the abstract, but by providing more concrete scenarios that they're meant to be similar to the political choices that citizens actually make in their lives as citizens of democracies. We have a lot of evidence here, much more than we have time to show. We don't have a full 2 hours, so we'll just give you a taste of the general direction of this evidence. Okay, so let's start with the scenario approach. So the strategy here is to present respondents with statements about specific actions that violate democratic norms without explicitly mentioning that this is about democracy. Respondents then report the level of agreement with the different statements. You can see examples of survey items related to executive aggrandizement here in this slide, and we combine them, or different items that we combine to create a scale of support for executive aggrandizement. So an example, the first item is when Congress is obstructing a president's agenda, the president should shut down Congress and govern on his or her own. So quite strong formulations. So on the next slide here, we have predicted values of support for executive aggrandizement by birth cohort, controlling for a full battery of covariates, including gender, party ID, economic deprivation, and so on. We see relatively strong cohort effects, with younger cohorts clearly more open to executive aggrandizement. So we're looking at predicted values of about 0.2 for the oldest cohort and over 0.3 for the youngest cohort. We also constructed a scale of support for limiting voting rights using these two items that I'm presenting here. Plotting the predicted values, we can see a similar pattern. I'll change the slide just in a sec so you have a time to look at the items, and this is what the graph looks like. We can see sort of the same pattern, but perhaps a bit less strong. The cohort differences are smaller than for executive aggrandizement, but they still look like it still looks like there's something to be said about cohort effects here. Moving on to the vignette experiments, we introduced these in our surveys filled in 2020 at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. So the vignettes describe a governor who faces opposition from the state legislature and wants to shut it down in order to impose his or her preferred policy on coronavirus lockdowns. So again, this is quite a strong formulation, literally shutting down an entire branch of government because you disagree with it. We experimentally manipulate the governor's objective, either to open up the economy or to continue the lockdown, and the governor's party. The respondents are then asked to indicate whether they agree that the governor should shut down the legislature. So looking at the results, and this is not depicted here, but it's notable that there's essentially no partisan effect. The party identity of the governor doesn't seem to matter at all for any cohort. There is, however, a cohort effect. So younger people are more inclined to allow the governor to shut down the legislature. On the y-axis here, you have the proportion in each cohort that agree that the governor should shut down the legislature. So despite using an entirely different measurement tool than the abstract survey questions that we examined earlier, the conclusion is similar. So it makes very clear that younger cohorts are not as committed to democracy as older generations. So far we've looked into the critical citizen argument and didn't really find any supporting evidence. Instead, we find that the link between dissatisfaction and support is stronger for younger cohorts. We also found that younger cohorts are generally more in support of a strong leader, even among those who support democracy to the highest degree. Therefore, it seems like younger cohorts are more confused about the alternatives to democracy. We've also tested how younger cohorts react to actual undemocratic situations and found, again, the same cohort patterns. So we can dig deeper here and see whether democratic knowledge has anything to do with all of this. We developed a scale of what we call democratic knowledge, which essentially measures if people can recognize actions that we would all think of as undemocratic, or at least I hope that everyone in this room would. We show respondents various scenarios and we ask them to evaluate them in degrees of being democratic or undemocratic. So for instance, respondents would be shown the following: a prime minister or president attacks the legitimacy of an election in which they have been defeated, or a government blocks peaceful protests by its political opponents. Respondents would then indicate how democratic or undemocratic each action was in their view. So we add up the correct answers to form a democratic knowledge scale, and we see strong cohort differences as you can see in this figure here. In fact, the youngest cohort in the US is the least likely to know whether a situation is democratic or not, with about 4 correct answers out of 8 total items versus almost 7 rather for the oldest cohort. Note that the items were not particularly difficult, just to make that clear. And in our research, we show that this knowledge is key in rejecting or condoning democratic backsliding. The patterns are similar for Canada. We also have a survey with this full democratic knowledge scale in Canada, just about the same. To give you an example of this, the figure presented here shows regression coefficients attached to the different cohorts for models predicting support for executive aggrandizement. So remember that executive aggrandizement is measured, or you won't remember it because I didn't mention it, but let's mention it now. Executive aggrandizement, that scale is measured from 0 to 1. And what we can see is in the left panel, we have estimates for a model with a full battery of covariates, and we see quite large differences across cohorts, with coefficients exceeding 0.1 for the two youngest cohorts, again on a 0 to 1 scale, with a mean of about 0.3. So these are quite enormous effects. Now, the right panel shows estimates from the exact same model, except that now democratic knowledge is added to the right-hand side. The cohort differences decrease by a fair bit, so a lack of clarity about what democracy entails might explain part of the worrying patterns that we've covered in this presentation. But still, there remain appreciable differences between the cohorts, as you can see. So there is still something that we can't explain, even accounting for democratic knowledge. And with that, I turn it back to Dietlind.
Yes, and so just the last slide here, what does it all mean for the future of democracy? We have summarized our findings on that slide, so I won't repeat that. But our conclusion generally seems to be a bit bleak. We set out to prove Foa and Monk when we first started the project. We wanted to prove them wrong. But the deeper we dug and the more the patterns seem to repeat themselves. Of course, we are not claiming that all members of the younger cohorts are less committed to democracy. That would be foolish. But some of them have been very critical and have been supportive of democratic innovation, use social media to speak out, and so on. But on average, the lack of understanding about what's democratic and what is not seems to make younger cohorts more oblivious to various aspects of democracy. Their dissatisfaction with democracy, although not high and higher than other cohorts, also is more damning for their support. So far, our results suggest that should democracy be under threat, which it is in some ways in the Western world, and concretely in some systems more than others, we cannot really count on the support of the younger cohorts more disproportionately to other cohorts. And that is something we will try to find out more about as we go along with the project, and we will also try to look into some policy solutions that would bring younger cohorts back to supporting democracy more fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Dietlind. Maybe Allison can try to set up her presentation. Yes, hand clapping, very important. I can do it live. My microphone's open. So we have the dreaded three panel presentation, Allison. So we gotta figure something out. Oh, perfect. So without further ado.
So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's always fun to talk about these things at the CSDC because we're drawing on a lot of the research that's been done over the years by CSDC members. What I'm going to be presenting on today is a project that I've been working on for a few years now with Jordan Mansell, who's at UWO right now, Melanee Thomas at Calgary, and Tania Gosselin at UQAM. And the motivation for the project is really to understand, or the original motivation actually, and you'll see that has taken a turn in the project that I'm presenting today, to really look about why women don't feel as political as men in a lot of different ways in terms of interest and efficacy. And what we've done over the course of this project is really changed our lens to focus on why men think they are so political and what are the consequences of that for how they think about women's role in politics. So the starting point for this project is the oft statement comment that politics is really a man's domain. There's something very gendered masculine about politics. And this explanation comes up often in the research that looks at women's lower levels of interest and efficacy in politics, but also in the ways in which we understand the various formal and informal barriers to politics. So whether it's gendered interpretations of candidates, the ways in which party organizations view the competitiveness of candidates, and how electors might interpret various competition in very gendered ways. And the focus in this literature has often been very much focused on women and how women are viewed and how gender norms around femininity actually play in the political realm. But as members of the CSDC and many others have said, there's also the counter and the other side of this, where politics being a masculine domain provides all kinds of advantages to men in that sphere. Men are viewed as stereotypical in that domain, and it comes with advantages in terms of how they're understood, the latitude they have to work and to succeed in that domain. And this angle, I think, is something that gets a lot less attention. So if we think about politics as a masculine domain, what does that mean? There has to be some kind of a mechanism that translates this domain-specific gendered conception to people. And that mechanism is gendered socialization. So this negative and pervasive social norms that characterize politics as a natural domain for men. And in doing so, in adopting these norms about what politics looks like, it actively discourages women's political engagement with that sphere. This type of explanation around gendered socialization often is used as a residual category when we can't explain away gender gaps in any other way. So we'll look at education levels and employment status and marital status and lots of other explanations that are linked to both structural and situational explanations. And when we can't get rid of it all, we think that socialization is the explanation. And again, I think one of the shortcomings in this literature is it largely ignores how gender operates among men. So if we think about these norms and what are the types of norms that are transmitted through gender socialization, it really forces us to think about what's in that black box of explanation that we often don't operationalize in our studies. And when we're talking about politics as a gendered domain and gendered socialization more generally, we started thinking about what that means. What are the types of norms that are transmitted as being particularly masculine? And the things that came out of our discussions around this is really the idea of competition being important. Autonomy and aggression often are characterized as masculine characteristics. And there's also, with autonomy comes certain self-confidence that one can dominate within a given sphere. And so when we start thinking about what the mechanisms are around gendered socialization, they really play into some of these stereotypical characteristics that are associated with what men are good at, but also about the ways in which men should and do comport themselves. In this study, we really focus in on that dimension of competition, and we draw on both literature in experimental economics as well as in cognitive psychology to start thinking about how men and women react differently to competition more generally, not just necessarily competition in the realm of politics. Competition, to define it, occurs when rewards are given to people on the basis of how their performance compares with the performances of others doing the same task or participating in the same event. And we think this kind of definition that's operationalized across economics games actually corresponds very well with how we think about the game of politics, about who gets what, when, and how. That kind of definition of politics is really about a competition over resources and the ways in which those resources are distributed across the population. If we look at that literature in economics and psychology, they're pretty consistent and coherent in the findings that they report in terms of the ways in which competition is gendered. Often they observe that women are more averse to competition, more risk averse in general, and also more likely to attribute their loss to something they did. So if we think back to that self-confidence item, this idea that women don't necessarily like to compete as much, and when they fail, they often attribute it to something they've done. Men, on the other hand, have a higher preference for competition. If you tell men and women that they can pick two different games, one where they're guaranteed to get money for various tasks and another where they can earn more, but only if they win, they're much more likely to choose that competitive task than women are. So they're less risk averse. They have a higher preference for competition in general. And I think the point that's, I think, quite interesting is they also tend to be overconfident. They're much more likely to think they're going to win than they actually are to win. And I think this echoes a really fascinating finding in political science around gender differences in political knowledge, where some of the explanation for that difference is really in men just the guess. They're going to throw out an answer even if they don't necessarily know it. So these types of gender dynamics, I think, translate and help us understand some of the ways in which men and women might or might not engage in politics as a competitive field. So if competition is itself gendered and politics is a competitive activity with high levels of risk, uncertainty, as well as a pretty important potential for failure and loss, we came up with a series of expectations and formal hypotheses that we pre-registered before we ran this study. And they really vary in two ways. We have some specific expectations for women that really came out of our larger research agenda trying to understand these gender differences. And then a series of expectations for men, where we think about the ways in which men might react to women becoming more and more successful in these competitive adventures, competitive environments. So our first is really about women if they don't do well in a competition. So when they receive negative feedback about their performance, is our formal way of talking about this. So they compete and they don't do well. We think that might have spillover into their political ambition or their perception of how ambitious they are, their political efficacy and their interest in politics. For men, when they received negative feedback, and here it's important to say relative to women. So when you tell men they're going to lose to women, we expect them to express higher levels of general sexism, but also to express what we talk about as political sexism, so a greater preference for men as political leaders. And our third hypothesis is really an extension of this one, that we expect this to be particularly the case for men who think of themselves in very gendered terms. So we operationalize that by thinking about men who identify strongly as masculine. Those three expectations we explore in a study that we did in May 2019 with an MTurk sample of just under 1,300 respondents. Everyone in the study was paid with a per-minute type of setup where we used very standard MTurk ideas around hourly pay. And what we did is we created a very simple non-political competitive task. And I'm going to explain that a little bit. So this is really a pilot. We had all these ideas about how to operationalize competition, and this was our solution to that. So we used a mechanical line task, which had time constraints to make sure it was stressful. And all the respondents were asked to do was to move a series of lines along their screen to match a pattern. So it's just a mechanical task. There's nothing political about it. And we created it as a competition because there were incentives built into the game so that if they were in the top 20% of doing this correctly, they had a chance to win $20, which is a pretty good return on their investment. And then we measure both a categorical measure of gender, where we ask people if they identify as women, men, or non-binary, and then a continuous measure of gender, where we ask people to rank themselves on feeling thermometers of feminine and masculine. And the experiment is really about the information that we provide about gendered competition. So everyone is randomized based on their categorical gender identification into one of 4 conditions. In one condition, they just do the mechanical task, and then we ask them questions. In the 3 others, we provide them information about their performance. So in one, we tell women or men that they tend to perform worse on this activity than the other gendered outgroup. And we vary whether they get that information before or after the mechanical task. So that's the first 2 treatments. And then we have one which is just very individual. So after they perform it, we tell them how they did compared to other people. And so these are performance feedback mechanisms within the competition that have an explicitly gendered component to them. And then after they do this mechanical task, we ask them to provide information about their self-assessed political ambition, political efficacy, and interest. So those are all related to that first hypothesis that we had specifically about women. And then a preference for men in political leadership, as well as a version of Blick and Fisk's hostile and benevolent sexism, which are really related to our second and third hypotheses about men and the types of political backlash they might express towards women. What do we find? So remember that first hypothesis, is about whether or not competition really suppresses women's psychological engagement. And this is a pretty high bar given the experiment. There was nothing political about it. And we wanted to know if it spilled over in women's sense of competence in the political realm. And what we find is really no evidence. There's just no consistent effects where our treatments moved women in any way, shape, or form on these measures of psychological engagement, ambition, interest, and efficacy. Where we actually find a lot more action, and I think this is interesting because our study really was focused on this first hypothesis, and we built up our hypotheses around men almost as an afterthought, but this is really where the findings in the paper become interesting. So for the second hypothesis about whether or not competition increases men's hostility towards women generally and in politics, we find higher levels of sexism in both of those gendered feedback conditions. So whether they got the prime before or after the task, it increased sexism among men by 5 or 6 percentage points. And it also had a similar increase in their preference for men in political leadership. Here we only found it in the post-treatment, not when they were given it prior. So there's some evidence consistent with this idea that when they compete and they're told they're not going to do as well to a gender outgroup, that the result is that they actually express higher levels of both general and political sexism. The third hypothesis was whether or not this was particularly the case for men who conceive of themselves in very masculine terms. And what we see here is a very similar pattern as we observed in hypothesis 2, but that the findings are a bit stronger. So we find higher levels of sexism, this time only in the pre-task prime, and it led to about an 11% increase in sexism among men who thought of themselves as masculine. So what we are talking about is in the paper that we have associated with this, about having a very gender stereotypical perception of their gender. And we also find higher levels of preference for men in leadership. And again, the size of that effect is somewhat larger than in the findings for the second hypothesis. What does this mean? This first study, as I said, was really exploratory. We were thinking about the ways in which we could operationalize competition to help us explain some of the gender gaps that are persistent despite women's increasing representation in politics, despite their increasing education levels. And we really find little evidence that the way in which we operationalized it here affected their psychological engagement with politics. Men, however, were moderately sensitive to competition. And this is despite the fact that it was a simple task for which they should have had no expectation of competence. And it wasn't political in any way, shape, or form. But what happened is when you told them they were likely or did lose to women, that they generally expressed higher levels of both sexism and sexism towards women in politics. So the comeback is, well, there's lots of limits. What does line task have to do with generalizing women's engagement in politics and men's backlash against women? And I think this domain-specific competition is really an important direction. And so to address that, we recently did another study last fall where we again collected an MTurk sample. And this time we modified that mechanical task. So it's no longer a line task, it's a political information task, as well as information tasks in other domains, where people are timed in their capacity to move pictures to the right names. We use those gendered performance primes again in this study, but this time we vary the type of domain in which they have to do these political knowledge tasks. We have sports personalities, so a traditionally masculine competitive domain where men should have the expectation of being better than women. Pop culture personalities, a feminine domain where women are expected to come in and do better, and then political personalities. And in all of these scenarios, we have gender balanced images. So they get as many female tennis players as they get male tennis players, so that it's realistic to tell women or men that they're doing more poorly in terms of the outgender. And this is really where we think the action is, thinking through some of the ways in which can we reproduce those, I think, stark but important findings from our first study, but also how can we generalize them to the political domain in a much more coherent and tied fashion. And so we have these data, we are analyzing them as we speak. So whether or not they're gonna all of it's gonna wash out the same way in our second study, we think it has the potential anyways to talk about some of the really important dynamics that we're observing in politics, and also take up the mantle that many gender and politics scholars have said about refocusing some of the research, not necessarily explaining why women don't participate, but why men feel so comfortable and overconfident in these spaces and how we can operationalize that in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Now I want to know what happens in study number 2, so I'll give you 5 minutes to do across that. But okay, jokes aside, I'm trying to be funny. Doesn't work always. I will ask now if there is question from the audience. How we can proceed is you can either raise your hand with the Zoom options under reaction, or you can just send me a private message or a general message indicating that you would like to ask a question. I see that there was already a ton of people that want to intervene. So let us begin with Claire. On va commencer, excusez-moi. J'ai parlé en anglais, je ne m'en suis même pas rendu compte. C'est ça le niveau de bilinguisme dans ma famille. On va commencer avec Claire Durand qui va poser la première question. On vous écoute, Claire. N'oubliez pas de... le micro est...
Oui, c'est correct. Mais je peux la poser en anglais. First, I'm impressed. I liked it very much. I have perhaps two. Question for Dietlind. It seems, unless I did not understand everything, you presented most of your U.S. research or U.S. and Canada, but at the beginning you said that you used the ESS survey, I think. So perhaps I mix up, but did you present something that from this ESS survey? And for Allison, I'm like Jean-François. I would like so much to have your result on the study number 2. I thought the study number 1 was very interesting, and study number 2 would be even more. And it's interesting for something like me who was in politics in the 1970s and 1980s as one of the few women at that time.
Merci Claire. Je vais prendre une autre question, puis on va y aller avec les réponses. Donc, j'ai Valériane Maillot.
Oui, donc merci. Genre, les deux présentations étaient super intéressantes. J'avais des questions pour Dietlind et puis Olivier. Je suis désolée, j'ai raté le début de votre présentation, donc je ne sais pas si une de mes questions va recouper ça. Moi, j'étais curieuse de savoir s'il y avait potentiellement un effet d'âge. Là, vous parlez d'effet de cohorte, mais est-ce que potentiellement, genre, l'âge, tu sais, there would be a learning effect through age, through the life cycle, that could explain the differences between the cohorts, and whether you've considered whether there would be a period effect as well in terms of the period in which some of the youth have been socialized. And I was wondering whether ultimately the main message in terms of policy outputs is that there's a big role to be played by education, I guess, in terms of getting youth to be more knowledgeable about democracy and what can be called undemocratic, and understanding how democracy works.
OK, on va laisser la chance aux auteurs de réagir ici, puis après ça, on procède avec une autre série de questions. On a quand même beaucoup de temps, là, donc je ne veux pas... Donc, inquiétez-vous pas, tout le monde va avoir la chance d'intervenir.
So, I mean, I guess we're not confident yet. We've just started those analyses, so I don't want to give you a punchline that's not correct. Jordan might want to jump in. He's been in the weeds a little bit more of the data analysis, but don't feel obligated, Jordan. That was just to say we should have another conference next year, and I'll tell you what happened.
Très bien. Est-ce que Olivier ou Dietlind veulent réagir?
Olivier, tu veux répondre?
Yeah, so I'll be speaking French and Dietlind is speaking. I'll be speaking English and Dietlind speaks in French, so this is confusing. But I was asked in English, so I'll answer in English. With regard to the ESS data, we're mostly using it to look at stated importance of democracy across different countries, given the large sample size and the leverage that we get over Europe. and also about satisfaction with democracy. Our data covers the US and Canada for now, and we've had ideas about doing surveys in Europe as well. But obviously the breadth of coverage in terms of just the countries of the ESS is hard to match. That being said, we quite like our measures, obviously, of support for executive aggrandizement, our conjoint measure, our vignette experiments, which are not in the ESS. So it's a bit of a patchwork of different measures, which all have their advantages and disadvantages. Now, with regard to the period effects versus age versus cohort, that's something that we could address with ESS data, which has been done in the past couple of years. There have been articles showing that there are essentially no cohort effects with regard to importance of democracy. But obviously, with our data in the US and Canada, we have 3 surveys over 3 years, so we don't have much leverage over that. We would love to have our vignettes since the 1980s, but unfortunately, we don't. But that's definitely something to think about. Just don't think we have the leverage with our data to really contribute to that particular, to disentangle the cohort effects from the period effects and the age effects.
Okay. I guess that we covered all the points. Like, I'm sorry, I'm sort of feeling like I'm in a control center and I have like 50 different things to look at. So I found a newfound respect for people who chair panels on Zoom. But that being said, I have a very important question coming up by Thierry Chiasson, and we'll take Isadora as well, Isadora Borges Monroy as well following that. So the floor is yours, Thierry.
Merci Jean-François. Je vais poser ma question en français. C'est une question pour Dietlind et Olivier. Je ne sais pas si vous avez été capable de creuser un peu sur peut-être la capacité de développer un portrait peut-être archétypal, oui, de ce jeune qui est confus, en fait. Je voudrais savoir quels sont les facteurs sociodémographiques qui semblent expliquer la présence de cette attitude de confusion. Est-ce qu'on retrouve ça davantage dans certaines catégories sociodémographiques? Est-ce que le niveau d'éducation est corrélé avec ça? Je voudrais vous entendre peut-être un peu plus sur ce portrait-là, puis si vous avez été capable de le déterminer.
Merci Thierry. Isadora.
Thank you. I have a question for the first set of results presented by Olivier and Dietlind, and a suggestion for Allison. So, to what extent do you think that the measures of democracy are actually measures of American-style democracy? Because there's no mechanism for closing Congress, but there is, dissolution of parliament in non-presidential regimes. So maybe that also explains a bit what the changes in attitudes, maybe not generationally, but at least the failure of democracy being seen more harshly by non-Americans specifically. And to Allison, I wanted to suggest maybe running these experiments again in a subsample of gamers. There's been a lot of discussion about sexism within the gaming community, but also this is where you would find women who are habituated into competition, either online gamers or like offline gamers. I think that would be an interesting point of comparison about the socialization of competition itself.
Thank you. We'll start with Olivier and Dietlind this round, and then following Allison's response. Thanks.
Olivier, do you want to answer Thierry's questions about the social demographics?
Ça me semble vraiment une excellente idée. En fait, on n'est pas encore rendu là dans le projet, mais définitivement, on pourrait prendre, par exemple, Democratic Knowledge Scale comme dependent variable, à la place de l'insérer du côté droit de la régression. Là. Donc, je pense que c'est absolument une excellente idée. Puis, on n'a pas eu le temps encore de plonger là-dedans, là, mais merci beaucoup pour la suggestion. C'est très apprécié. Should I take Isidora's question as well?
I have an answer to that.
Okay.
But I mean, we do have controls in our models. So we know that the kind of background of people who, so education does play a big role here, and that's also for the young generation. So we want to dig deeper into that in the future. But education seems to be the most important factor here. About Isadora on the different scenarios. I mean, that's kind of part of what we want to do. We want to create scenarios that play around all different political systems. So we have a Canadian version of shutting down the parliament, versus Congress and so on. And we do adjust it to the political system. So I think our questions in theory, I mean, and we do have many other scenarios. This was just one of many. And so once we will collect data in Europe, we will adjust it to that. For now, we only have our own scenarios in North America, where all of these questions are fairly similar.
And if I may add, we do have generally higher support for executive aggrandizement in Canada, which might make sense given the institutional differences, for sure. And there are some items that are just unambiguously terrible, and you shouldn't support it in any type of system. There's no institutional justification for any of it. So something like completely ignoring courts because you don't like their decisions, or the sort of items that there's no discussion to be had.
Merci. Maintenant, on va passer à Allison.
Just quickly, so that I think is a great suggestion to think about gaming communities. We actually have thought about that, but in a different way. So in study 2, we ask about people's background in competitive sports as a way of capturing men and women who have been in really competitive environments. And so high-level competitive women who have in sports, we think would maybe capture some of those same types of environments as women gamers. But thanks.
Très bien. Maintenant, j'ai des questions qui nous proviennent de Henry Milner. Et là, je ne savais pas que ceux qui présentaient avaient le droit de poser des questions aussi. On va faire une exception avec Dietlind qui va poser la prochaine question. Donc, on vous écoute, Henry, et ensuite Dietlind.
Okay. Do you hear me? Is it okay? Okay. What worries me about these kind of generalizations from American data, in the case of the second paper, there are many European countries, the Scandinavian ones, which I know best, where where women are equally likely to participate in politics. So I'm not quite sure how your kind of individual study would apply. But my main concern is the first paper, and I think the American case really could be very much exceptional, and I really would await comparative data. The reason I think it's exceptional is that the earlier cohorts grew up in a very different United States, one where Democrats and Republicans respected each other, worked together. I could describe it at length, how different the political reality was for people who are now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s than it is for people who were born in this last century and so on. So it seems to me perfectly reasonable why younger cohorts would have these be much more differently, relate very differently to democracy, because what they're seeing is incredibly different from what the previous cohorts saw when they were in their formative period. Now, I don't know how you can build that into an analysis without doing comparative analysis with countries where they haven't gone through this kind of transformation. So that would be my suggestion and question.
Yeah, I have a question for Allison before answering your question, Henry. So I thought this was a really wonderful study. And my question is why you thought, or maybe it is because you didn't think it through for men from the a kind of onset of the study. But why do you think it is so important for men to see the competition with women particularly? And why is it not about competition in general? I can imagine that women and men would react differently, not just to competing with the other sex, but to competing with others in general. And I think there is something maybe to be said that would bring out even much more than what you found with the angle on women, which brings out also some hostility, as you found, which is interesting. But I would like to hear more about that general angle of competition.
So how about you start, Allison, you answer,
okay.
Pick and choose, and then we move on to Olivier and Dietlind. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the question about whether we could get similar effects with other types of social identification groups, I think is really, really interesting. I can speak to one of the aspects though, because we had a fourth treatment group or a third treatment group plus the control, where we just gave them their individual performance. And we find very little happening there. And so while it doesn't, I think, go to the heart of your comment, it wasn't just, if you tell people they do badly, they get mad at everyone. They get mad at the group that they were competing against, and whether that's a specifically gendered phenomenon or if it could play into other salient social identities, I think is a great question. But I think we can say it doesn't seem to be just about losing. It seems
I guess it was more about the external validity of it, because in the real world, that's what you do. You're competing against both sexes politically and yeah, in other ways. So
and so the background thinking is really work showing that men move right with the emancipation of women in lots of ways. That kind of dynamic where we think men are actually reacting to women's entrance in politics. As again, I think we've gone to a very micro level here, but I think that's the context in which we're thinking about that gendered competition specifically in politics.
Merci. So, Olivier, Dietlind.
Yeah, Henry, thanks for this comment. I thought you would have a comment on this paper. I just want to point out that we also thought it would be unique to the US. We also thought that For One Monk would be wrong. I think we don't think that anymore given our data. But of course, we don't have our own batteries in Europe yet. But we only see that the phenomenon that is being described in the first place about lower support for democracy is also there in Scandinavian countries. We see it in Denmark, we see it in Finland, and so on. So it's not just a phenomenon in the US. But when we look at the cross-national data set more intensely and look at generational and life cycle effects and period effects and so on, what we do see is that there is a more pronounced effect in the Anglo-Saxon democracies. So our choice of Canada and the US is confirmed, and also in the UK as well. So more pronounced there than in other countries, but it's also there in other countries. Olivier, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to mention that our Canadian data, our original Canadian survey data as well, more or less follows the pattern from the US. Maybe the cohort effects are maybe a little bit smaller in Canada, but there's also the same pattern we find in the US is also present in Canada along all of the measures essentially that we presented today, all the different tools to measure this.
Merci. So I have Aaron on my list. Claire, you've already asked a question, so I'm going to jump in and ask another question, and then I'll leave the floor to you about that. So without further ado, Aaron.
Thanks, everyone. And I think this is going very well, and great presentation, both excellent presentations, and it's really, Dietland did great to see this project progress. And Olivier, I've seen a few earlier versions of some of these parts of these projects, and it's great to see how it's all coming together. I do want to just follow up on Valériane's question here. Not that I know that you can't say anything from your own data here, but I haven't seen like a written version of the paper, but I do think these APCG age period cohort generation like effects are going to really fundamental to framing the paper, because because if you can't rule out age effects, then you're talking in a world of like vastly different interpretations of what this data actually means. And I think my prior would be that this is mainly age effects. Now you can tell me I'm wrong, and you can, which I probably am, or you can tell me how, the percent of this that might be age, relative, the ratio of age to non-age related effects, which might be a useful sense. But I think my sense is for the framing of the paper that reviewers and everybody else are immediately going to jump to this. And so it needs to be kind of front and center how you're placing the paper within that APCG problem, because otherwise we're kind of left in a bit of a quandary about how to interpret the results, which I think are great, and I think they're very well clearly presented, but without that, without some kind of estimate, and maybe there's a way to bound the ratio, like the rate, I think having some kind of estimate of the proportion that are age effects given previous literature would be a good way to think about it. And to put some bounds potentially on what of this could be explained by age effects. Anyhow, I'll be quiet. I haven't seen the paper again, but it's a great presentation. I just thought that struck me as if I was reviewing that paper, that would be.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, you stole my question. I wanted to ask something similar because Valériane and also Florence Vallée-Dubois and Ruth and myself, we've looked at age cohort and sort of effects by events, right, over long periods of time. And Claire did that as well on the sovereignty support over time, if I recall. And so what's to be done? That's sort of Aaron's question, but just plugging my own work in there so I look smart. And just to follow up on this maybe second point is one line in Olivier's and Dietland's presentation and the conclusion that kind of left me a little bit wondering what that implies is when you wrote dissatisfaction translate more into lack of support. That's the last line of your presentation, I think, and you really didn't expand on that because I'm thinking, if you want to be very pessimistic, you can say, oh, the global warming is we're all doomed as a human race, and I'm 20 years old and I don't see anything working. The governments are divided; they don't take action into one of the most important problems facing humanity, etc., etc. So what we need is a benevolent dictator, right? As opposed to saying, we have these authoritarian scales from the 50s and 60s who were trying to figure out, why people supported the Nazis and whatnot in Europe. I think this is two separate things. I mean, I don't. It sounds like it's a similar backsliding, but really perhaps it's something else, and you've hinted to that in your talk, and I want to hear more about this. Thank you. So yeah, we could, I guess, Claire, you want to ask your question now or wait?
I can ask it now, but it's a bit different. Did you think, it's for Dietland, did you think about looking at another way to measure whether people are critical citizens, which is trust in institutions? Because your findings go together with the finding that the more democratic a society, the less trust in institutions. And your other finding about supporting strong leader goes in that direction as well. So like hypothesis one could be checked using trust instead of satisfaction with democracy. That's my point. Mm-hmm.
Très bien, merci Claire. Donc, Dietland, most of the action is towards you and Olivier.
It's Olivier, and also I should say Elisabeth, who is here, and I think we can give the difficult questions to her, don't you think, Olivier? Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll go ahead on the age period cohort effects. I agree with all of you, and I think that's extremely important. And I think our contribution is that basically just the descriptive statistics themselves, people can't agree on. Just looking at literally the means of importance of democracy, there's an issue, a special issue, online issue of the Journal of Democracy about this particular question and the interpretation of what Faux and Monk presented. So before even getting into what is driving the difference, the most basic question is there a difference? Just looking like cross-sectionally, right, at just a given point in time, is there even a difference? And I think with regards to the nominal measures that we critique, it's becoming clear, but even then there was a lot of debate about this for a couple of years. And our contribution is to bring these other sorts of measure. But I think you're completely right with regards to cohort, period, and age effects, which we can't disentangle with the data that we have. But I think you're entirely correct. And Jean-François, with regard to your point about, I think your point is that different generations might be supporting backsliding for different reasons, right? So that the nature of backsliding is different. And I think that's entirely right. And we try to measure this. We're not done with this quite yet, but we try to measure this by presenting scenarios with specific issues. So one issue that might be driving support for backsliding among youth is, like you said, climate change. And we have an experiment with this where we ask respondents whether they think that such and such an issue is more important than governing democratically. And we see the sharpest differences by cohort, definitely with regard to the climate change issue. A lot more youth say that combating climate change is more important than governing democratically compared to other types of issues that would perhaps be more relevant for the oldest cohort. So I think that's entirely right. We're just not quite there yet, but I think that's right.
Yeah, I just want to add that in terms of age, cohort, and generation, of course, I agree to what Olivier just said, but that also our findings show that it's not just the youngest group. It's really a much broader phenomenon. Our age group goes up to the age of 40 now, and we also see the effects actually of the third group that includes the people who are 50. So it's really a break between the younger cohorts and the older cohorts. And still, we do have to ideally draw another model, which we cannot with our data. But you know, our findings go much beyond that as a very small and thin age group. Yes, Claire, I think this needs to be our next step. The dissatisfaction with democracy is not the only way of testing critical citizens, but it was our first way, and we will move to political distrust now. So thank you for pointing that out.
Okay. Thank you, Dietlind. I know Henry has a question, but I realized once again a big failure on my part that this panel was supposed to end at 2:30, right? And I know some of you have some prior engagements that they need to attend to. So unless Henry's question, because I can take Henry's question, but I know Allison, you have important things to do. So Henry, if your question is for Allison, then forget it. If not, then Allison, you are excused. People are excused. We can take this one last question, and we have to take a break at 2:45. So let's just put in another 5 minutes, if you don't mind. People are sending me messages right now in private saying I'm doing a terrible job, but I put my foot down. So Henry, is your question for Allison or for Dietlind?
I'll be very quick.
Okay.
I'm just responding to the point that was made when I was answered, which was that the Canada, US, and Britain seem to be countries where this was especially salient. And maybe I should suggest that a factor explaining that is the electoral system, that when you have a winner-take-all kind of electoral system, you have more abrupt changes. And that could be felt. Then it's not just age, then cohorts might feel that more, while in proportional systems, on the whole, other things being equal, change is more gradual, and you're less likely to see these kind of reactions. There's an age aspect that applies everywhere, but I think that the cohort aspect is particularly likely, more likely in a winner-take-all kind of situation Plus, as I said, the American case is extremely salient because of the extreme changes that they've gone through during the period. So that would just be my suggestion for an explanation of what's going on, rather than what the unfortunate, although real explanation is. We really need to worry about the current generations, that democracy is really threatened. And I'd rather not come to that conclusion if we can find other explanations for what's going on.
I completely agree, Henry. And on that, we will pause. It's still Win is still the same link, right? To attend the next panel. Am I correct?
Yes, I will keep the link open.
Right. So you can just stick around and chat with me if you want. No, or close your camera, and we will convene again at 3 o'clock. And Ruth is going to do, Professor Dassonville is going to do a much better job of keeping things organized for the next panel of our wonderful conference. I want to thank the participant for 2 wonderful papers, and you audience. Without you, this would not be possible. Thanks for coming and asking all these interesting questions, and we've got more of this coming up in a moment.
Everyone.
Thank you. Merci. Merci à tous. On revient à 15 heures avec le prochain panel, le dernier panel de la journée. Merci.